I called the cops on my sister's criminal kids, then she made a move that changed everything. Hey Reddit, I've been a long-time lurker, and like most of you, I've read some truly jaw-dropping stories here. But I never imagined I'd have one of my own to share, one that feels more like a bad dream than real life. I've been struggling to come to terms with a decision I made recently, a decision that fractured my family and has left me questioning whether I did the right thing. The truth is, I called the cops on my own nephews. My sister Diane and I were incredibly close growing up. We weren't just siblings, we were partners in mischief, confidants, and each other's biggest supporters. But as we grew older, life took us down very different paths. Diane married young and had 2 boys, Tim and Robbie, while I stayed single and focused on my career. Despite our different lifestyles, we stayed close for a long time, and I always admired how Diane seemed to juggle everything. In the beginning, Diane was the kind of mom who was on top of everything. She was strict but fair, ensuring her boys had structure and guidance. I used to look at her and think, she's got this. But somewhere along the way, that discipline turned into indulgence. At first, it was subtle, letting small things slide, bending the rules when it was easier than enforcing them. But those small cracks eventually widened into a gaping chasm. Tim and Robbie weren't just unruly kids, they were turning into full-blown troublemakers. What started as harmless pranks quickly escalated into vandalism, petty theft, and harassment. By the time they were teenagers, they had a reputation in the neighborhood, and not the kind you'd want. Parents warned their kids to steer clear of Diane's house, and neighbors started locking their cars and keeping an eye on their security cameras whenever Tim and Robbie were around. Diane, however, was firmly in denial. Anytime someone brought up her boys' behavior, she brushed it off with excuses like, boys will be boys, or, they're just going through a phase. She refused to acknowledge the reality of what was happening, even as their actions became increasingly destructive. The tipping point for the neighborhood came when Tim and Robbie targeted an elderly woman down the street. She had spent years creating a beautiful garden, a peaceful sanctuary filled with flowers, ornaments, and even a small fountain. One night, she woke up to find the entire garden destroyed, flowers ripped out, ornaments smashed, and the fountain overturned. It was heartbreaking to see, and everyone knew who was responsible. But Diane refused to believe it. She accused the neighbors of picking on her kids and insisted they'd never do something so cruel. Her refusal to face reality only fueled Tim and Robbie's behavior. They knew they could get away with anything because their mom would always defend them. And then it got personal. One evening, I came home to find my car vandalized. Deep scratches ran from the hood to the trunk, and the word snitch was carved into the driver's door. My stomach dropped as I realized this wasn't just random, it was a message. I had tried to talk to Diane about her sons a few times before, and while our conversations always ended in her defensiveness, I never thought they'd turn their hostility toward me. I confronted Diane the next day, hoping this time she'd take things seriously. But instead of acknowledging the damage her sons had done, she accused me of being too hard on them. She dismissed the vandalism as just kids being kids and told me I was making a big deal out of nothing. It was like talking to a wall, and it hit me, she wasn't just ignoring the problem. She was enabling it. That night, I wrestled with what to do. Diane is my sister, and no matter how bad things had gotten, I still cared about her. But this wasn't just about me. Tim and Robbie were terrorizing the neighborhood, and Diane's refusal to rein them in was making things worse. The line had been crossed, and I couldn't sit back and let it continue. So, I made the call. Filing a police report against my own family was one of the hardest things I've ever done. The officers were professional and sympathetic, but they made it clear that without hard evidence, there wasn't much they could do right away. They encouraged me to start documenting everything, photos, timestamps, witnesses, anything that could build a case. I thought calling the cops would scare Tim and Robbie into backing off, but I couldn't have been more wrong. The next morning, I woke up to find my front window shattered. A large rock had been thrown through it, and attached to the rock was a note scrawled in messy handwriting, "You'll regret this." That note changed everything. It wasn't just vandalism anymore, it was a threat. And as much as I wanted to believe it was just teenage bravado, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was going to get worse before it got better. The most disturbing part came later that day. While I was cleaning up the broken glass, I noticed something wedged under the bushes outside my house. It was a discarded pack of cigarettes, the kind Tim was known to smoke. My heart sank. They hadn't just vandalized my property, they'd been close enough to leave something behind. They weren't just lashing out blindly, they were watching me. I knew then that this wasn't going to end with one call to the cops. Diane's denial had given her sons a sense of invincibility, and now that someone was standing up to them, they weren't going to let it slide. What I didn't know was just how far they, and Diane, were willing to go. The shattered window and the note should have been enough to shake me, but what really terrified me was the pack of cigarettes. It wasn't just vandalism anymore, it was personal, calculated, and deliberate. Tim and Robbie weren't just lashing out in anger. They were sending a message, they knew I had called the cops, and they wanted me to feel vulnerable in my own home. I spent the next few hours cleaning up the broken glass and documenting everything. I took photos of the damage, the rock, the note, and even the cigarette pack. Every detail mattered now. The police had made it clear that without evidence, their hands were tied, and I wasn't going to let this slip through the cracks. But the more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. Tim and Robbie's actions had always been bold, but this felt different. It wasn't just mischief, it was a direct challenge. And it made me wonder, how far would they go? That evening, I decided to install security cameras around my property. It wasn't cheap, but I needed peace of mind. As I worked, setting up the cameras and testing their angles, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see one of them lurking in the shadows. The paranoia was exhausting, but I couldn't ignore it. The first night after installing the cameras was eerily quiet. For the first time in weeks, I slept soundly, thinking maybe the cameras had scared them off. But when I checked the footage the next morning, my stomach dropped. At 2:43 a.m., two figures had appeared at the edge of the yard. They lingered just out of the camera's range, their movements cautious and deliberate. One of them, taller and lankier, threw a small object toward my house, before they both sprinted away. I hadn't noticed anything out of place when I left for work that morning, but when I reviewed the footage frame by frame, I saw it, a flash of something metallic hitting the porch steps before bouncing into the grass. I rushed outside, combing through the yard until I found it, a pocketknife, the blade snapped off at the hinge. It wasn't just a random piece of junk, it was another message. I called the police again, handing over the footage and the knife. This time, they seemed more concerned. The escalation was clear, and they assured me they would start monitoring the area more closely. It was a small comfort, but at least it felt like something was being done. But Diane's reaction was what truly left me speechless. When the officers stopped by her house to question Tim and Robbie, she didn't just deny their involvement, she went on the offensive. She called me later that day, furious, accusing me of trying to ruin her family and turn the neighborhood against her boys. She claimed the footage didn't prove anything and accused me of targeting them because I never liked them. Her refusal to see the truth was maddening, but it was also deeply revealing. Diane wasn't just blind to her son's behavior, she was actively enabling it. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized how much of this mess was rooted in her denial. But the situation wasn't just about Diane anymore. Tim and Robbie were out of control, and they knew it. Their actions weren't the impulsive mistakes of kids who didn't know better. They were deliberate, calculated, and escalating. The final straw came a few days later when the neighborhood had its breaking point. It started with a series of minor incidents, more slashed tires, graffiti on fences, and tipped-over trash cans. But then the power in several houses went out, all on the same block. When the neighbors investigated, they found the cause: someone had tampered with the transformers, cutting wires, and leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. It was dangerous, reckless, and potentially deadly. And once again, all signs pointed to Tim and Robbie. The neighborhood was in an uproar. People were furious, demanding answers and action. Someone organized a meeting at a nearby community center, and almost everyone on the block showed up. The tension in the room was palpable, and it didn't take long for the conversation to turn toward Diane and her sons. I stayed quiet at first, unsure if speaking up would make things worse. But when someone mentioned my broken window and the rock with the threatening note, I felt the eyes of the room turn to me. They wanted answers, and I realized I couldn't stay silent anymore. I told them everything: the vandalism, the threats, the cigarette pack, and the security footage. I explained how Diane had refused to hold her sons accountable, even as their behavior grew more dangerous. The room was silent as I spoke, the weight of the situation settling over everyone. But as the meeting ended and people began to leave, I noticed something strange. A man I didn't recognize lingered near the back of the room, watching me intently. He didn't approach or say anything, but his presence was unsettling. When I left the community center, he was gone. That night, as I reviewed the security footage from my cameras, I spotted a figure walking down the street, pausing briefly in front of my house before disappearing into the darkness. And that's when I realized, this wasn't just about Tim and Robbie anymore. Something bigger was happening, and I wasn't sure I was ready to face it. The man at the community meeting haunted my thoughts for days. I couldn't shake the way he had lingered in the background, silently observing, his eyes fixed on me as I spoke. I told myself he might have just been another concerned neighbor, but the way he disappeared without a word felt deliberate, almost calculated. Things had already been spiraling out of control with Tim and Robbie, but now, a new sense of unease settled over me. Someone was watching, and it didn't feel like the reckless bravado of teenage boys anymore. It felt colder, more intentional. The morning after the meeting, I woke up to find an envelope taped to my front door. It was plain, with no markings or return address, but the weight of it sent a chill down my spine. I opened it carefully, and inside was a single piece of paper with a message scrawled in uneven handwriting. "Stay out of it. This isn't your fight." It wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. I recognized the cigarette pack discarded in my yard, the vandalism, and the lingering figure in the security footage. It was all connected. But this message wasn't just another threat from Tim and Robbie. It felt like someone else was pulling the strings, someone who had a vested interest in keeping me silent. I handed the note over to the police, along with the security footage of the figure from the night before. They promised to look into it, but I could tell by their expressions that they didn't have much to go on. The officers urged me to stay vigilant and keep documenting everything, but their reassurances did little to ease my growing anxiety. As I delved deeper into what was happening, I decided to do something I hadn't done in years. I reached out to a few of Diane's old friends from her younger days. I wanted to know if they had noticed anything odd or if they could offer insight into how things had gotten so bad. Most of them hadn't spoken to Diane in years, but one person, in particular, had something chilling to say. I got a call from a woman named Karen, who used to be one of Diane's closest friends back when we were younger. She hadn't spoken to my sister in over a decade but admitted she'd heard whispers about the trouble her family had been causing. Then she dropped a bombshell. "I don't think this is just about Diane's boys," she said. "She's been in debt for years. Big debt. And not the kind you can just work your way out of." According to Karen, Diane had been borrowing money from questionable sources for years, first to support her sons, then to maintain a lifestyle she couldn't afford. The debts had piled up, and Diane had burned through any legitimate means of paying them back. Karen didn't have specifics, but she hinted at rumors that Diane had gotten involved with someone dangerous to keep herself afloat. It hit me like a ton of bricks. Diane's refusal to hold Tim and Robbie accountable suddenly made a twisted kind of sense. They weren't just acting out on their own, Diane had been enabling them because she needed to keep them close. They were her leverage, her bargaining chips in whatever mess she'd gotten herself into. That night, as I processed what Karen had told me, I received another notification from my security cameras. A figure was moving outside my house again, sticking to the shadows, but lingering just long enough to make their presence known. I called the police immediately, but by the time they arrived, the person was gone. The officers reassured me they would increase patrols in the area, but their growing concern was evident. Something bigger was happening, something they couldn't yet piece together. A few days later, everything came to a head. It was late, and I was getting ready for bed when I heard a loud crash outside. My heart raced as I grabbed my phone and pulled up the live feed from the security cameras. What I saw made my blood run cold. Two figures were standing in my driveway, one holding a baseball bat and the other holding a can of spray paint. My car, which had already been vandalized once, was their target again. I watched as the bat-wielding figure smashed the side mirrors and windshield while the other scrawled something in bold red letters across the hood. "Mind your business." I called 911, my hands trembling as I tried to stay calm. The dispatcher stayed on the line with me until the police arrived, but by the time they got there, the vandals were gone. As the officers took my statement and examined the damage, one of them pulled me aside. He told me that while they couldn't prove anything yet, it was becoming clear that this wasn't just random mischief. The escalation, the threats, the deliberate intimidation, it was part of a larger pattern. That's when I made a decision. I wasn't going to let Diane, Tim, or anyone else drag me or the neighborhood down any further. If my sister was caught up in something criminal, then I was going to find out what it was, and I was going to expose it. The next morning, I started digging into Diane's life. I combed through public records, looking for anything that might explain her behavior. What I found sent shivers down my spine. Diane wasn't just in debt, she had a history of liens and judgments filed against her, dating back years. And then there were the connections. One name kept coming up in her records, a man linked to multiple incidents of fraud and extortion. A man who, as I would later discover, had been arrested years ago for running an illegal operation targeting desperate families. It all made sense. Diane wasn't just enabling her son's behavior to protect them, she was doing it because she was trapped. But the most chilling realization came when I found out who the man was. He was the same figure I had seen at the community meeting. Discovering the connection between Diane and the man from the community meeting felt like the final piece of a dark and twisted puzzle. His name, Anthony Russo, was tied to multiple criminal operations over the years, ranging from fraud schemes to extortion rings targeting vulnerable families. This wasn't just about Diane's poor parenting or Tim and Robbie's delinquency, this was something far more sinister. I couldn't shake the image of Anthony's face at the community meeting, watching me intently as I shared my story. It wasn't just casual interest, it was scrutiny, calculated and unnerving. And now that I knew his history, his presence took on an entirely new meaning. It became clear to me that Diane's situation wasn't just a case of enabling her sons to protect them. She was likely protecting herself, too. If she was in deep with someone like Anthony, her every move might be dictated by fear. The more I thought about it, the more Diane's erratic behavior over the years began to make sense, her constant defensiveness, her refusal to acknowledge Tim and Robbie's escalating actions, and her isolation from the family. She wasn't just blind to what her kids were doing, she was using their behavior as a shield. But the question remained, why? Why had she gotten involved with someone like Anthony in the first place? And how far would she go to keep whatever secrets she was hiding? The answer came sooner than I expected. A few days after my discovery, I received a call from one of the police officers handling my case. They had identified one of the figures in the security footage from my driveway. It was Robbie. The other figure, however, remained unidentified. While this wasn't enough for an arrest, it added another layer of tension to the situation. The officer also mentioned something chilling. While reviewing the footage, they had noticed a car parked across the street during the vandalism, a black sedan registered to none other than Anthony Russo. The pieces were falling into place. Tim and Robbie weren't acting alone, they were being directed. And Anthony wasn't just some distant figure in Diane's life, he was actively involved in what was happening now. That night, I confronted Diane. It wasn't a calm conversation or an attempt to understand her side. I was furious, and I wanted answers. I told her everything I had discovered, the debts, the ties to Anthony, the the security footage. For a moment, I thought she might deny it all, but her face crumpled under the weight of the accusations. She admitted that she had borrowed money from Anthony years ago, back when her financial troubles began. At first, it seemed innocent enough, just a loan to cover some unexpected expenses. But as time went on, the debt ballooned, and the terms became more demanding. Anthony wasn't just a loan shark, he was a predator, and Diane had walked straight into his trap. According to Diane, Anthony had started using Tim and Robbie as leverage when she couldn't pay. He encouraged their bad behavior, feeding their egos and fueling their sense of invincibility. Diane claimed she tried to push back, but by then, it was too late. Anthony had his hooks in her, and she felt powerless to stop him. I wanted to feel sympathy for her, but all I could think about was the destruction her decisions had caused. Diane might have been a victim in some ways, but her refusal to take responsibility had allowed Anthony to turn Tim and Robbie into pawns in his schemes. The breaking point came when Diane confessed something I hadn't expected. Anthony wasn't just manipulating her financially, he had threatened her safety. She admitted that the note left with the rock wasn't from Tim or Robbie. It was from Anthony. He wanted her to keep me quiet, to make sure I didn't dig any deeper. But he underestimated me. After hearing Diane's story, I knew we couldn't handle this alone. I took everything I had, Diane's confession, the footage, the connection to Anthony, and went back to the police. This time, they took it seriously. The combination of evidence and Diane's cooperation gave them enough to open a formal investigation into Anthony's activities. But Anthony wasn't about to go down quietly. 2 days after Diane's confession, my cameras captured another chilling scene. In the middle of the night, Anthony himself showed up at Diane's house. He wasn't alone, he had 2 men with him, and they weren't there for a friendly visit. I called the police immediately, praying they'd arrive in time. As I watched the scene unfold on my screen, I felt helpless. Anthony wasn't just a shadowy figure anymore, he was here, in our neighborhood, making his presence known. When the police arrived, Anthony and his men tried to play it cool, claiming they were just visiting a friend. But the officers weren't buying it. They detained him for questioning, and while it wasn't enough for an arrest, it sent a clear message: we weren't backing down. The next few days were tense, but the investigation was gaining traction. The police uncovered a network of operations tied to Anthony, including illegal loans, extortion, and connections to local crimes. Diane's cooperation became a key piece of the puzzle, and while it didn't absolve her of her role in enabling her sons, it was a step toward making things right. But the real turning point came when Tim and Robbie were brought in for questioning. At first, they were defiant, convinced they could talk their way out of it. But when faced with the evidence, the security footage, the vandalism, and their connection to Anthony, they cracked. Their confessions were damning. Not only did they admit to the crimes they had committed, but they also revealed the extent of Anthony's influence over them. He had used them to intimidate neighbors, collect debts, and create chaos. They weren't just troublemaking teenagers, they were pawns in a much larger game. The confessions from Tim and Robbie unraveled Anthony Russo's entire operation like a string being pulled from a carefully constructed web. What the police uncovered during their investigation was far worse than anyone had anticipated. Anthony wasn't just a small-time criminal exploiting desperate people, he was the mastermind behind an extensive operation that reached far beyond our neighborhood. Over the course of weeks, the police raided Anthony's properties, seizing evidence that painted a grim picture of his empire. He had orchestrated loan-sharking schemes, engaged in fraud, and used threats of violence to keep his victims in line. Families, like Diane's, had been pushed to the brink, but others hadn't been as lucky. Some had lost their homes, their livelihoods, and, in a few cases, their freedom after being forced to participate in his schemes. The depths of his cruelty were staggering. For Diane, this was a reckoning she couldn't avoid. She was called to testify against Anthony, her testimony becoming a key piece of the case that ultimately led to his conviction. But testifying came with a price. She was forced to confront her own role in the chaos, how she had allowed herself to be manipulated, how she had let her boys become tools in Anthony's schemes, and how her denial had enabled the destruction of the community around her. Tim and Robbie didn't escape unscathed either. Their confessions had been the tipping point for the investigation, but it didn't absolve them of the damage they had caused. The judge overseeing their case acknowledged their age, but made it clear their actions had real consequences. They were sentenced to juvenile detention and ordered to undergo mandatory therapy, along with community service. It wasn't just a punishment, it was a chance for them to change. Diane, though not criminally charged, couldn't avoid the fallout. Her reputation in the neighborhood was destroyed. People who had once turned a blind eye to her son's behavior now saw her as complicit. She had no choice but to sell her house and leave, moving to a smaller town where she could attempt to rebuild her life far from the people she had alienated. But Anthony wasn't as lucky. With the overwhelming evidence stacked against him, he was convicted on multiple charges, including extortion, fraud, and conspiracy. His sentence was severe, decades in prison with no chance of early release. For the first time in years, the neighborhood could breathe a collective sigh of relief, knowing that the man who had caused so much fear and harm was finally gone. Still, the aftermath of everything left a heavy weight on my shoulders. Diane had been my sister, my friend, someone I had grown up idolizing in many ways. Seeing her fall so far was heartbreaking. The chaos she brought into my life, the betrayal, and the collateral damage her decisions caused, none of it could be ignored. Months later, Diane reached out to me. Her message was hesitant and apologetic. She admitted she had been too proud and too afraid to ask for help when she needed it most. She confessed that she had lied to herself, convincing herself that she could control the situation even as it spiraled further out of her grasp. She said she wished she had listened to me earlier, before everything had fallen apart. I stared at her message for hours, torn between anger and sympathy. A part of me wanted to forgive her, to move past everything and try to rebuild what we had lost. But another part of me couldn't forget the fear, the threats, the sleepless nights spent wondering how far Tim and Robbie, or Anthony, would go to silence me. In the end, I decided to respond. I told Diane I was glad she was trying to take responsibility for her actions, but I made it clear that rebuilding trust wouldn't be easy. I encouraged her to focus on herself and her sons, to ensure they learned from their mistakes and didn't repeat them. Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't about excusing her behavior, it was about freeing myself from the weight of what had happened. Tim and Robbie eventually returned home after serving their sentences, but they weren't the same boys who had terrorized the neighborhood. The time in juvenile detention and mandatory therapy had forced them to confront their actions in ways they never had before. Robbie, the younger and more impressionable of the two, started attending community college, while Tim found work with a local construction crew. They weren't perfect, but they were trying. As for me, I finally found peace in my home. The cameras that once symbolized fear and vulnerability became a quiet reminder of what I had survived. The neighborhood, too, began to heal. People started reconnecting, building bonds that had been fractured by the chaos Anthony and his schemes had caused. But the scars of what had happened remained. The empty lot where Diane's house once stood was a constant reminder of the choices that led to the unraveling of her life. Anthony's conviction had brought justice, but it didn't erase the pain he had inflicted on so many. Looking back, I realized that calling the cops wasn't just about protecting myself, it was about standing up for what was right, even when it meant going against someone I loved. It was about breaking a cycle of denial, manipulation, and fear that had gone on for far too long. Sometimes, doing the right thing comes at a cost. It tests your resolve, your relationships, and your sense of self. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's this: family doesn't mean turning a blind eye. True loyalty is holding the people you love accountable, even when it's hard. In the end, I don't regret the choices I made. They weren't easy, and they didn't come without pain, but they brought clarity and a sense of freedom I hadn't felt in years. And for that, I'm grateful.